My name is Claire. I'm 26 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with design. Interior design, architecture, the way spaces could make people feel something just by the way light and structure work together. I didn't come from a wealthy family, not even close, but I grew up flipping through design magazines the way other kids read comic books. By the time I was in high school, I was drawing floor plans on graph paper while my classmates doodled cartoon characters. And when I finally graduated college with a degree in design, I made a promise to myself. I would build something that was mine, not something handed to me, not something borrowed, but something that came from my vision, my blood, my sweat. And for 2 years, I did exactly that. Every spare dollar I had, every hour I wasn't working shifts at the cafe or doing freelance design work, I poured into renovating an old downtown studio. It was a crumbling, dusty, abandoned space when I signed the lease, but I saw potential. I saw sunlight streaming through big warehouse windows. I saw polished concrete floors, exposed brick, sleek lines mixed with warm wood accents. I saw my future office, my gallery, my place to show clients what I could do. And I worked like hell. Weekends spent sanding, nights painting until my arms ached, watching YouTube tutorials when I didn't know how to install something, calling in favors from friends who knew a bit about plumbing or electrical work. I sacrificed dinners out, vacations, new clothes, because this was the dream. This was the project that was going to change everything. And then came my brother, Tyler. Tyler has always been the golden child. He's 2 years older than me, but he's never really worked for anything. He's charming, reckless, the kind of guy who coasts through life because people clean up his messes. My parents, especially my mom, have always covered for him. When he wrecked his first car, they said it wasn't his fault. When he dropped out of college after one semester, they said maybe school just wasn't his thing. When he got fired for his third job for not showing up, Mom said the boss was probably unreasonable. Meanwhile, I was the one working doubles, saving receipts, making lists. But I loved him. He was my brother. I thought maybe one day he'd grow up. I was wrong. Because the day he wrecked my dream project, it wasn't an accident. Not really. It was thoughtless, careless, a reflection of who he had always been. He had been using my studio for hanging out when I wasn't there. I didn't know about it at first, until one of my neighbors casually mentioned, "Hey, your brother was over there with his friends the other night. They were pretty loud." I confronted him, told him the space wasn't a playground, that I was working on something important. He laughed it off, said I was too serious, that I should chill out. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. One Saturday, I walked into the studio and my heart stopped. Beer bottles everywhere, trash piled up in corners, a hole in the drywall where someone had punched it. But the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it, was the floor. I had just finished polishing the concrete the week before, a smooth, glass-like surface that had taken me months to get right. And there it was. A massive oil stain, black and sticky, spreading like a wound. Someone had dragged in a motorcycle, his friend's motorcycle, onto my pristine floor. They had worked on it inside my studio, spilled oil, and left it there. My dream project ruined in one night of stupidity. I remember just standing there, shaking, unable to breathe. Tyler came in a few minutes later, grinning like nothing was wrong. "Hey, Claire Bear," he said, using that childhood nickname like it still meant something. When he saw my face, his smile faltered. I asked him what the hell happened, and he shrugged. Shrugged. "Relax, it's not that bad. It's just a floor." Just the floor I had worked months on, the floor that set the tone for the entire space, the floor that clients would see when they walked in. It wasn't just a floor, it was everything. I lost it. I screamed, I cried, I told him he had no idea what he'd done. And do you know what he did? He rolled his eyes, like I was the one being dramatic. That night, I went home and told my parents what had happened. I expected, no, I needed them to finally see it, to finally hold him accountable. But instead, my mom sighed, like I was telling her the weather. Claire, he didn't mean it. You know how your brother is. You need to forgive and forget. Forgive and forget, as if my months of work meant nothing, as if my dream could be patched up with a shrug, as if his carelessness was just something I had to live with. My dad didn't say much, just sat there reading his paper, like always. And Tyler? He smirked. He actually smirked at me because he knew he'd gotten away with it. Again. That was the night something inside me snapped. I smiled at my mom, nodded, said, "You're right. I'll forgive and forget." But in my head, I was making a promise of my own. I wasn't going to forgive, and I sure as hell wasn't going to forget. If Tyler thought he could ruin my dream and walk away laughing, he had another thing coming. I was done being the sister who swallowed her anger. I was done being the daughter who carried the weight while everyone else excused his failures. That night, lying awake staring at the ceiling, I felt the anger settle into something sharper, cold, focused. Revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about balance, about finally showing everyone, especially him, that actions had consequences, that I wasn't someone to be stepped on. And so while my mom thought I was moving on, I was actually planning, watching, waiting. Every move Tyler made, every weakness he had, I cataloged it. And I began to build something new. Not just a project, but a plan. A plan to make sure Tyler would finally feel the weight of his choices the way I had felt the weight of mine. A plan that would change everything.
The days after the floor disaster were some of the hardest I've ever lived through, not just because of the mess itself, but because of the way my family reacted, or rather, the way they didn't. I had expected anger, disappointment, at least a conversation about what Tyler had done. Instead, it was brushed aside, like my dream wasn't even worth raising a voice over. My mom kept repeating her line, "Claire, you need to forgive and forget. Life's too short for grudges," like it was some sort of wisdom, when really it was just an excuse for her favorite child. My dad hid behind his silence as usual, the quiet referee who never blew the whistle. And Tyler strutted around like a man who had won some invisible battle. He'd ruined something irreplaceable and still got to sit at the dinner table without a scratch on his reputation. I would sit across from him, pushing food around my plate, while he told stories about his friends, his nights out, how crazy things had been. Every story was just another reminder that he got to live carelessly while I had to claw for everything I had. It hurt in a way I can't fully explain, because it wasn't just about the floor. It was about years of imbalance, years of my parents defending him, years of me swallowing my frustration. I thought about my studio constantly, about how I would have to sand and seal again, about the extra money I didn't have, about how every delay pushed back my launch. And every time I thought about it, I heard my mother's voice. "Forgive and forget." It echoed in my head like a taunt. Forgive, forget, no. Instead, I started paying attention to Tyler in a way I hadn't before. I noticed the way he borrowed money from mom without paying it back, the way he always had some new business idea that never made it past the talking stage, the way his friends were loyal when the drinks were flowing, but absent when he needed real help. Tyler was a man who lived on credit, financial, emotional, social. He took and took and took, confident that someone else would pay the bill when it came due. And for the first time in my life, I realized I could make sure that bill landed right in his lap. The anger that had once made me cry now made me cold. I stopped telling Tyler my plans, stopped letting him know what I was doing at the studio, stopped giving him any access to my work. Instead, I played along. I smiled when my mom urged us to make up. I nodded when Tyler said he'd make it up to me someday. I even pretended to soften when he joked about being my favorite brother, like nothing had happened. But inside, I was cataloging every weakness, every crack in his golden boy armor. Because the truth was, Tyler wasn't untouchable. He wasn't even careful. And I was the only one in the family who saw it. At night, when everyone else was asleep, I'd lie in bed planning, my mind racing. What would hurt him most? What would finally make him feel what I had felt? Helpless, unseen, dismissed? Revenge wasn't about breaking him physically, it was about hitting him where it counted. For me, the dream he destroyed was my project, my career. For him, I realized his dream wasn't something he had built because Tyler had never built anything. His dream was the image he had, the life of the carefree, charming guy everyone envied. If I could take that away, if I could expose him, if I could make him taste failure in front of the very people who had always excused him, then maybe, just maybe, he'd finally understand. And so, quietly, I began to set the stage. I started asking subtle questions when he bragged about his latest business scheme, pretending to be interested, writing down details he probably thought I would forget. I checked his social media, noticed patterns, the way he overshared when he drank. I even asked a few of my friends who'd crossed paths with him what they thought, and the stories they told painted a picture even uglier than I imagined. Missed payments, broken promises, small lies that added up to a reputation just waiting to collapse. Tyler thought he was untouchable, but really, he was standing on a house of cards, and I was going to be the one to blow. Meanwhile, my studio became both my sanctuary and my reminder of what I'd lost. I spent weeks scrubbing the oil, sanding, resealing, working alone into the early hours of the morning. Every brushstroke of paint, every sweep of dust became part of my therapy, but also part of my plan. Because as I rebuilt my dream, I was also building my revenge. And the beauty of it, no one suspected a thing. My parents thought I was moving on. Tyler thought I had caved, like always. But inside, I was sharper than I ever been. I was no longer the sister who quietly endured. I was the sister who was about to make her brother pay. Once the plan stopped being a private fantasy and became a schedule in my phone, everything shifted into a new, terrifying clarity. I chose the tools I knew would hurt him where it mattered. His image, his sham projects, the people who had enabled him by refusing to look closely, and I started quietly collecting evidence the way I used to collect paint chips. Obsessively, patiently, and with an eye for how small details fit into a whole. First, I cataloged receipts and invoices he'd left on counters when he borrowed my car to drop off a poster or ask Mom to front him for equipment. Then I asked a trusted vendor, the one who'd supplied materials for his half-baked pop-up shop, for a copy of the contract he'd signed and the check that had bounced. He looked embarrassed and relieved to wave it at me, admitting that Tyler had promised upfront payment and then ghosted. From there, I texted a few of Tyler's old collaborators, the graphic designer he'd hired and stiffed, the bar owner who'd lent him space for a launch party and never been paid for staffing. And when multiple people started telling the same small story about Tyler's charming pitch, then disappearing on invoices, the pattern felt less like coincidence and more like a system. I didn't want vengeance that read like a vendetta. I wanted a public correction, truth that would hurt because it was true. So I arranged meetings, not rants, and I took all the paper and digital trails to a lawyer I could trust. Eleanor from the co-op studio had once helped me register my small business name, and she connected me to a modest but sharp local attorney who specialized in contract disputes and consumer protection. And when he sat down across from me and said plainly, "You've got receipts, witnesses, and a timeline. That's not gossip, that's leverage." Relief pooled weirdly in my chest like cool water inside a fever. With counsel, I drafted a careful plan. Gather testimony, document financial promises, ask the vendors to write short statements of damages, and prepare a public-facing narrative that was factual, narrow, and impossible to call slanderous because every claim would be accompanied by proof. Meanwhile, I began the quieter, more difficult work of sewing allies into the fabric of the city. The magazine editor who'd once profiled a friend of mine and loved a good human story angle. The neighborhood coffee shop owner who'd been subtly harmed by Tyler's unpaid tabs when he'd booked a fundraiser for a band that never paid.
the curator at the community art center who remembered Tyler promising sponsorships that never materialized. Each person surprised at first when I asked for time, but eventually grateful for the chance to speak, because most of them had assumed complaining would accomplish nothing. While I set those threads, I worked publicly on the studio relaunch, making it the event that would both celebrate what I'd reconstructed and act as the pivot for the exposure. Grand reopening, a new chapter, read the invites I plastered through our neighborhood and handed to the same people Tyler had dazzled. Because timing matters. I wanted the audience that cared about art and business and neighborhood trust to be in the room when the truth came out. Behind the scenes, I practiced being calm, how to read from the folder without breaking, how to let others speak and not rush to fill silence, how to let evidence do the talking while I kept my voice steady. The rehearsal of the reveal felt almost holy. One night, my mother asked me if this was really necessary, and for a moment, the old habit of softening rose up in me, but then I remembered Tyler's shrug at the dinner table, as if my dream were a spill to be mopped up. And I said nothing about revenge, only that I wanted accountability, and she folded her hands and went upstairs without comment. The day of the reopening arrived in a wash of nervous light, and I watched the room fill with people who had been small kindnesses to me. The barista, my college mentor, a couple of vendors, plus a scattering of people who had known Tyler's smile too well. Tyler himself heard about it through Mom and, predictably, showed up to support my sister, the way men like him imagine trophy attendance looks like penance. He strode in, flirted with acquaintances, and took the empty corner seat that said he had no real intention of staying long. I started by welcoming everyone, told a short story about the studio's rebirth, and about how art that endures has to be rebuilt sometimes. And then, when the room was warm and the nerves were sharp, I invited the vendo I'd worked with into the light. Not to shame, but to tell a simple story. He talked about the deposit that never cleared, about the unpaid invoice, about how he had to turn down another order because he'd been waiting for Tyler's payment. Then, one by one, the others who had been wronged stepped forward. The graphic designer with the botched invoice, the bar owner with the missing staffing check, the community art center curator who had been promised support and instead had been left with canceled programs. The editor from the local magazine sat at a table taking notes with the bright, hungry patience of someone who knows how to shape a narrative. Every voice was calm, measured, and accompanied by a sheet of paper that bore dates and amounts and short text message threads. I watched Tyler's face change color slowly, from smug to tight to finally an internal panic you could see in the collapse around his mouth. Someone in the back, one of the loyal friends who'd usually laughed at his jokes, leaned forward and asked a pointed question about his promise to pay, and Tyler's attempt at a disarming joke bounced off like a pebble against a window. After the testimonies came the hardest practical move. We had the attorney send a polite, formal demand letter to Tyler the next morning, copied to his email and to the bar where he had promised sponsorship, and it asked for immediate reconciliation, or we would forward the evidence to the Better Business Bureau and the Small Claims Court. Instead of doing something dramatic or illegal, I used the system. Documentation, formal notice, witnesses, and the simplest, surest thing happened. The illusion began to crack. Tyler lashed out privately first, frantic messages to Mom, then to mutual friends, begging them to say we were overreacting, to call the whole thing misunderstandings. But people who'd once excused him now kept their distance. The editor called me 2 days later and asked if I'd be willing to give a longer interview. We scheduled a piece that would run in the weekend edition and would examine a pattern of charming pitches that ended in unpaid bills, a phenomenon the city had grumbled about but never cataloged. When the article published, it was careful and fair, but it contained the facts, dates, amounts, and quotes from vendors. In the comments, people I'd never met thanked me for shedding light on a pattern they'd suspected but shrugged off as part of modern hustle culture. As the story spread through neighborhoods and social feeds, Tyler's invites dried up. His business partners stopped returning text when asked to corroborate his claims, and one by one the small projects he'd used as proof of cred began to evaporate. Contracts rescinded, spaces reclaimed by owners who no longer trusted his promises. The family dynamic shifted too. Mom, who'd said forgive and forget as if forgiveness could be a bandage over a repeated pattern, now sat across from my father with legal emails open on her tablet, and for the first time I saw the old certainty in her eyes give way to worry. She asked how much the invoices were, then asked very quietly whether Tyler had always been like this. I told her the truth in a way that left room for her to process it herself, then got back to the studio and kept working. There were near misses. Twice, Tyler phoned the attorney demanding retraction and threatening defamation suits if we published anything else. And for one fraud afternoon, the editor worried about legal exposure and delayed the piece. I paced the studio like a caged animal until the editor called back, relieved, saying they'd vetted everything, and the publisher stood behind them. At night, I lay awake with adrenaline and dread, realizing sometimes righteous exposure takes patience and legal care, and guilt will find you even when you're doing the right thing. Worst of all, Tyler tried to sabotage my relaunch, a suspiciously timed complaint to the building manager about loud noises. A rumor spread that I'd stolen a vendor's design, but each time we matched the rumor with the paper trail and watched it fall flat. And then the first real blow landed. One of Tyler's larger backers, the person who'd always paid the designer deposit and then expected Tyler to deliver, the one who sent him a check for $8,000 for a pilot, called. Politely at first, with a question that unearthed more than we expected. Did you actually deliver for him? The answer after a painful and humiliating conversation with an embarrassed PR person was no. The money had been transferred and then spent elsewhere. Within a week, the backer asked for an audit and Tyler's pilot was frozen. I felt no small triumph then, not because money was the point, but because the scaffolding he'd built with charm had revealed itself as hollow. As the dominoes shifted, our family home no longer felt like a neutral ground. There were whispered conversations at the kitchen table, asterisks in Mom's eyes when she looked at Tyler, and a new, less forgiving curiosity from Dad. Yet even as things started to crumble around him, Tyler doubled down in private, flaring angry texts that tried to shame me for public humiliation, insisting I'd gone too far. My answer was always the same and simple. I had asked for accountability, and when you have proof, you present it. The kicker, the part of the plan that made me hold my breath and wait, was the grand reopening's final act. I'd scheduled a small panel with the editor, 2 vendors, and a legal counselor to speak about small business protections. I wanted the city to hear not just my story, but an ecosystem's need to be safeguarded. On the day of the panel, Tyler arrived and sat unmoving while the room filled with the kind of steady attention that used to orbit him. And as the panel wrapped with people thanking me for speaking up, I watched Tyler's shoulders slump in a way that felt like the exact shape of wakefulness. There was relief and something else, a realization maybe, forming on his face. When I left that night to lock up, the weight had changed in the house. It was lighter for me and heavier for him. But even as I shelved the final pamphlets and turned off the lights, I knew this was only the middle of the story. Reputations crumble slowly and sometimes unpredictably. There would be other battles, financial follow-throughs, possible legal counters, the slow work of my parents' trust reassembling, and in the quiet that followed the loud reveal, my chest thudded with exhaustion and a small ember of hope that the person who had made me choose silence might now finally have to listen. The cliff hung there, taut and humming. Would Tyler rebuild? Would he sink, or would something stranger happen? Would our family wake up to patterns it had chosen?
Tyler didn't disappear quietly. Instead, he went loud and procedural, which was the thing that scared me most because it meant he was willing to drag the whole story into a slow, costly noise, where truth gets muffled by lawyers and motion filings. And so the weeks that followed the reopening became a treadmill of small legal escalations. He retained an attorney with a reputation for fierce defensive posturing, sent a flurry of terse cease and desist emails to the editor and several vendors, and even filed a demand for mediation claiming reputational damage and defamation. But every step he took required us to respond in records and copies and sworn statements, and what should have been an easy unraveling turned into a bureaucratic chess game where moves must be precise and public sentiment matters more than ever. Suddenly, Mom's forgive and forget was not a soft lullaby, but a tensioned rope, because Tyler called her in tears, lamenting how I'd humiliated him in front of friends and clients. And she teetered between the girl protecting her son and the woman who had watched me rebuild a life. And it was obvious the family axis was bending. Aunt Joan suggested we host a family meeting to smooth things over. Dad listened to Tyler's lawyer on a phone call that ended in an exhausted silence. And I found myself answering impossible questions from relatives who wanted the peace of an old story rather than the mess of accountability. At the same time, Tyler's backers, desperate to avoid a public audit, floated settlement offers through intermediaries, small sums in exchange for confidentiality that would let him erase the paper trail without admitting wrongdoing. And hearing the exact numbers made my stomach turn, because the arithmetic of hush money is precisely the arithmetic abusers use to buy silence and keep cycles going. So I refused. Not for theatrics, but because I'd learned that a private payoff would let him do the same thing to someone else. And instead, with Eleanor and the attorney's guidance, I pushed for formal claims in small claims court and began coordinating with the editor on a follow-up feature that would examine the structural problem, not just Tyler's pattern. The local gossip mill, which had at first cheered my David versus Goliath energy, grew more complicated. Some neighbors whispered that I'd gone after a young man trying to make a life, while others thanked me for stepping into a truth they'd been afraid to name. I watched our block divide in small, subtle ways. Invitations left unsent, neutral nods replaced by cold avoidance, and it hurt, not because I expected unanimous support, but because the truth never travels cleanly without collateral. The first legal hearing was a blur of forms and posture. Tyler's lawyer trotted out that rehearsed thing where people call out misunderstanding and business disputes, but we had dates and amounts and witnesses, and watching a magistrate flip through pages and then schedule a mediation felt like watching a bell toll. The system could either correct the harm or give Tyler a second stage to rewrite what had happened. Meanwhile, Mom and I had more honest conversations than we'd shared in years. She admitted, voice tight, that she'd felt protecting Tyler was easier than confronting the idea he might be unreliable. And I told her that wanting forgiveness didn't obligate anyone to deny a pattern of harm. Those talks were raw and real and, oddly, the most intimate moments of the whole saga. Pressure from family didn't end there. Aunt Joan worried about charity donors seeing the story and pulling support. Dad stopped by the studio with offers of help that felt like attempts to broker silence. And at one point, Tyler cornered me in the driveway with a plea that teetered between apology and accusation. "You could have come to me first, Nat," he said, voice shaking like the wounded martyr he wanted people to believe he was. But when I asked for a clear apology and restitution for vendors, he offered platitudes and shifting blame instead. The mediation day was a long, fluorescent-lit negotiation where Tyler's team tried to trade off the designer's invoice for a vague promise to make amends later. Eleanor leaned across the table and whispered, "Do not let him bury this under vague promises." And I felt a strange rage at the ease with which some folks believe charm absolves responsibility. We declined the mediated half measure and filed claims in small claims court instead. And while that felt like a righteous path, it also meant the fight would drag on, that there would be depositions and subpoenas and a public record that might expose more than we intended. Then something unexpected happened that shifted the tenor of the battle. One of Tyler's former friends, a woman who'd once gushed about his charisma, reached out privately with a text that admitted she'd been complicit in covering for him because she'd been afraid to lose access to the social scene, and she asked to speak on the record. Her statement was the wedge that began to split his central narrative of misunderstood hustler, and when she testified about false promises and the emotional labor of lying for him, the courtroom air felt heavier with consequence. Even before any official ruling, the vendor community took a defensive posture. A few merchants organized a small coalition of local creatives, and together we drafted an open letter urging greater transparency for pop-up partnerships and deposit protections. And that collective voice gave me strength, because the problem wasn't personal, it was systemic. And the more we named the pattern, the less it felt like a family dispute, and the more it felt like a civic matter. Tyler's reaction escalated into cornered desperation. Anonymous social media posts that implied I'd orchestrated a campaign to ruin a young enterpriser, a late-night voicemail to my father in which he tried to conflate my activism with personal vengeance, and a terse message to the editor threatening collateral damage if they proceeded. But these moves only hardened my resolve because I'd already chosen a path that relied on documents and witness statements rather than rumors. That winter, the court ruled in favor of the vendors on several outstanding debts, ordering restitution for unpaid invoices and a formal public apology. Small victories, but real. And Tyler's finances, already fragile, tightened. He lost a backer who demanded immediate repayment, and several pop-up opportunities evaporated. The social consequences were sharper. People who had once laughed at his jokes now greeted him with polite distance, and watching his office hours empty was an eerie spectacle of consequence in action. Even so, the victory wasn't neat. Tyler hired a PR consultant who turned a few headlines into a narrative about young people trying and failing, and some outlets accepted that framing. I lived in the messy middle, some nights celebrating quiet wins, other days tired and raw, because justice is not a single moment, but a long, grinding process. The strain showed at family gatherings. Thanksgiving that year sat between us like a taut wire. Dad tried to keep conversations neutral, Aunt Joan made small talk with brittle edges, and Mom hovered between maternal instinct and a dawning comprehension of how love can blind people to patterns. She hugged me at the end of the night, her eyes wet and her voice small. "I'm proud of you for doing what I couldn't." And that admission felt like an armor patch, mending something inside both of us. Even as the legal dust settled a bit, Tyler refused to recede into private life. He continued to post cryptic photos and late-night manifestos about learning curves and being misunderstood, and for a terrifying week, he even lodged a countersuit alleging emotional distress, which required me to sit for a deposition and explain, calmly and precisely, the evidence I had compiled. Giving testimony was both draining and strangely clarifying. Recounting the dates and messages to a court reporter made the pattern feel incontrovertible, and when I left the courthouse, my limbs were heavy with relief and the weight of process. After months of hearings, a final small claims judgment required Tyler to pay restitution and inhibited him from representing as a vendor for 6 months in 2 local art spaces. Not enough to erase harm, but enough to prevent an immediate repeat. And the legal resolution gave me room to breathe and the vendor community time to reevaluate risk management. Yet even with the court's ruling, there was this gnawing private question that often woke me at 3 a.m. Had I become the person my mother feared? A woman steeped in grievance rather than forgiveness? The answer came in quiet moments. When a vendor I'd never met thanked me with a small, awkward handwritten note for caring enough to fight. When the community center reopened its summer program because someone paid the staffing bill that Tyler had left unpaid, and Mom called to say she'd offered a small loan to a designer who'd been stiffed, and I heard compassion in her voice. These were small restorations, and in them, my actions felt less like revenge and more like repair work. And still, the personal toll was real. Friendships frayed. A cousin who had once been close stopped returning texts, and Tyler's sporadic attempts to appeal to the family's compassion forced my mother into painful conversations about accountability and protection. At the same time, the studio's reputation expanded honestly. Clients began trusting our contracts more because they could see we prioritized fair business practices. We started offering basic contract templates to local creatives for free, a small project that cost little but felt huge in principle. And I sat across from the editor who'd covered our story, and we discussed turning the piece into a column about community safeguards. The final act of this stretch, the part that would define the moral arc, was not a dramatic courtroom scene, but a quiet dinner with Dad where he asked a question that made my chest tighten. Would you have done this if Tyler were a stranger? I stared at my hands, then, yes, I would have, I said simply, because harm doesn't get softer because the person.
Months passed after the judgment, and while Tyler kept a low profile in public, I knew from the occasional rumor that he was restless. Bouncing between half-baked schemes and ghost jobs, his once boisterous social calendar shrunk into fragments of invitations that fizzled as quickly as they came. And though a part of me wished that would be the end, the kind of quiet fade into irrelevance you see when people finally burn through their luck, something in me always knew Tyler wouldn't go silently. And I was right. Because the confrontation I had avoided for almost a year came on an unremarkable Saturday when I walked into the community center for our vendor meetup and found him waiting near the bulletin board,
leaning against the wall with that familiar smirk that was supposed to look charming, but now only looked desperate. And before I could turn away, he said, "So this is what winning feels like, huh?" In that mocking, half-bitter tone that still managed to sting. My heart thudded hard, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that he hadn't learned anything. He hadn't sat in his quiet months with reflection or remorse. He'd spent them nursing the same narrative where he was the victim and I was the villain, and the only way he knew how to soothe himself was by dragging me into another scene. The room fell hushed, a few vendors hanging back with watchful eyes, and I felt the weight of that moment, how every word I chose would either reinforce his fantasy of persecution or remind him and everyone listening of the simple truth. Accountability isn't cruelty, it's consequence. So I stepped closer, steady but not unkind, and said quietly but clearly, "This isn't about winning, Tyler. It's about cleaning up the mess you left behind. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt people who trusted you, people who depended on you, and all I did was make sure you couldn't walk away from that like it didn't matter." He tried to laugh it off, to shake his head and look around as if inviting someone to agree, but no one did, and the silence pressed heavy enough that his laughter died mid-breath, leaving only the shallow sound of his frustration. He muttered that I'd ruined his reputation, that I'd made it impossible for him to move forward, and I held his gaze as steadily as I could and told him something I hadn't planned but had been carrying inside me for months. "You did that yourself. I just made sure the truth had a place to stand." For a long moment he froze, like a man hearing his own reflection for the first time, and I thought maybe, just maybe, the armor he wore would crack. But then his eyes hardened again, the familiar wall sliding back into place, and he turned away with a bitter shrug, muttering, "Whatever, enjoy your little empire," before walking out the door into the afternoon light. And I realized in that instant that the closure I'd been waiting for would never come from him admitting fault or offering real apology. It would come only from me accepting that some people cling to denial like oxygen, and waiting for them to change is just another way of letting them hold your life hostage. That evening, after the meeting, I walked home in a quiet, golden haze, past the park where kids were playing and the diner where we used to eat pancakes on Sunday mornings, and I thought about how far I'd come from that moment when Mom first told me to forgive and forget, and how impossible those words felt now. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because forgetting would have meant erasing every lesson, every scar, every ounce of strength I'd built while clawing my way through the mess. I thought about my mother, who had softened over the months, no longer urging silence, but instead learning how to sit in discomfort, who once asked me if I ever regretted not taking the easier path, and how I told her gently that what I regretted most was not standing up for myself sooner. I thought about Dad, who'd come around slowly, his steady presence a kind of quiet blessing, and the vendors who had turned their pain into practical reforms that would protect others. And I thought about myself, standing in the ruins of what had been a dream project, realizing that sometimes you don't get to rebuild exactly what you lost. Sometimes you get something different, sharper and stronger because it's built on truth instead of denial. The final twist wasn't cinematic. No grand apology, no public collapse, no perfect reconciliation, but it was real. Tyler moved 2 towns over, tried to rebrand himself, and failed again. While I kept building, brick by brick, with people who valued honesty over charisma. And maybe the sweetest revenge of all wasn't the court judgment or the headlines, but the simple fact that I no longer flinched when his name came up, no longer felt that stab of doubt when family ties tugged at me, because I had proven to myself that I could survive the storm and walk out stronger. My payback wasn't just making him answer for what he did, it was reclaiming the power to write my own story, to say out loud, without hesitation, "My brother wrecked my dream project, my mother asked me to forgive and forget, but instead I chose to remember, and remembering set me free."